Hello, and welcome to today's webinar on the latest NHTSA-funded research, Engaging Youth to Choose Car-Free Mobility. I'm Lisa Patterson, and I will be your moderator for today. I am the Tech Transfer and Workforce Development Program Manager for TREC, the Transportation Research and Education Center at Portland State University. TREC leads the federally funded University Transportation Center, NHTSA, the National Institute for Transportation and Communities. NHTSA is one of 5 national centers across the U.S., and our research is focusing on improving mobility for people and goods to build strong communities. This Portland State-led partnership includes the University of Oregon, Oregon Institute of Technology, University of Utah, University of Arizona, and University of Texas at Arlington. Our webinars are based on our original research conducted by faculty, researchers, and students at these NHTSA partner universities. Our goal for these webinars is to get useful research results into the hands of practitioners, academics, and other stakeholders like yourselves. Our speaker today is Autumn Schaefer. Autumn Schaefer is an assistant professor in the University of Oregon School of Journalism and Communication. Her research seeks to address important social, theoretical, and practical issues related to public health promotion and social issues advocacy. She has a student-centered approach to teaching and seeks to create a collaborative and inclusive classroom environment where students feel both challenged and supported as they learn. Her research has included grant-funded projects examining the effects of entertainment education on teen pregnancy, developing a sexual consent awareness program, encouraging parents of children with eating disorders to take care of themselves to prevent caregiver fatigue, and cervical cancer prevention through the promotion of HPV vaccines. Schaefer's professional experience includes being a political campaign manager, field director, and a legislative aide in Washington State. All right. Before diving into the webinar, I'd like to give you to let you know about a few of our upcoming online events. On May 31st, Anne Brown from University of Oregon will be speaking at our Friday Transportation Seminar. She'll be discussing ride-hailing equity. You can join us online or in person if you're local. Our next webinar will be July 9th with Chris Monsier and Nathan McNeil from Portland State University, and they'll be presenting on contextual guidance at intersections for protected bike lanes. You can see our full schedule of upcoming events at trec.pdx.edu/events. And lastly, we also have our annual Transportation and Communities event coming up on September 19th and 20th. This event connects our national mobility-focused research to local practice through breakout panels, lightning talks, posters, and a keynote. Our keynote speaker this year will be Ben Wellington, a data scientist and policy analyst from New York. Day 2 will feature half-day workshops for a deeper dive into skill building. Registration is open and we have a preliminary schedule up, so go on and take a look at tcs2019.sketch.com. All right, and lastly, I'll give you a brief overview of the webinar. Autumn will present for about 40 minutes. During this time, you can submit questions, which will be answered at the end of the webinar. We will be recording today's webinar and we'll make it available on our website. You will also receive the video recording and presentation slides in an email following the webinar in the next day or two. If you are tracking professional development hours, this webinar is eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit. Instructions on how to redeem the credit will also be included in your post-webinar email. During the presentation, you may submit questions for Autumn by using the questions pane on your control panel. We will track the questions and she will respond to them at the end of the webinar. If we run out of time, we will send out written responses for any questions left unanswered. All right, and with that, I will go ahead and hand it over to Autumn.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks for joining. Really appreciate the NHTSA supporting this research, and I also want to acknowledge my graduate research assistant, Jared McCary, as an important partner in this work. I'm excited to talk with you all about what we learned on engaging youth to choose car-free mobility. First, I just want to give a sense of what is car-free mobility. Many of you may already know the definition, but just so we're all on the same page, it's really any means of transportation that doesn't involve a car. And primarily for teens, that includes walking, biking, riding transit, light rail, but it can include other things like skateboarding or a scooter. Being a passenger in a car is not considered car-free mobility. So just to get us on the same page again here, why is car-free mobility among youth so important? Why is it worth studying and listening to a webinar about? Because today's youth are tomorrow's decision makers. Transportation system planners have to think about sustainable long-term visions for their transportation systems from both an environmentally conscious and capacity perspectives, which includes engaging youth as current consumers and tomorrow's decision makers. Promoting support for and use of a planned transportation system that includes car-free mobility among youth helps contribute to a safe, healthy, and sustainable transportation system and foster more livable communities by providing secure mobility to a segment of the public, youth, who are typically restricted in their transportation choices. So many of them, for instance, are not old enough to drive yet. Increasing car-free mobility among youth is also strategic to help grow and sustain long-term use of non-car transportation options, because research suggests that the transportation system related beliefs and behaviors of youth are likely to influence their adult willingness to continue to use these services. And encouraging youth to engage with car-free mobility options may also increase their interest in transportation systems in general, which we hope would translate into future system support through voting, citizen engagement, and interest in transportation-related careers. So, that's from a transportation angle, some of the many reasons why it's important to think about this audience and how we can promote car-free mobility. There's also public health implications that I think are important for us all to keep in mind, stating to why this is so important. So in addition to the many reasons about our transportation systems, there's also direct impact on public health among US teens. So car accidents are the leading cause of death and a top cause of non-fatal injury among 10 to 24-year-olds in the US. The US also has the highest traffic fatality rate per capita among all of its peer countries. And these high fatality rates persist in the US despite declining crash rates per mile, because Americans, and especially young Americans, drive more than their peers in other countries. The US is predicted to continue to experience these depressed gains in reducing traffic fatalities unless more is done to get high-risk drivers like teens to choose car-free mobility. There was also a great study by Littman that came out in 2016 that showed that transit ridership is associated with decreased fatality rates among youth and the total population. Her research found that US cities with more transit-focused access and supportive policies have about half the average youth and total traffic fatality rates as cities with more automobile-focused policies and access. Promoting youth use of car-free mobility is likely to lower the fatality and injury rates among youth, but also among the general population. And that's because most of teen traffic accidents involve another car. I think it's about 75% involve another car. Okay, so just to focus back on our learning outcomes for today, now that we know what are we talking about, why is it important to talk about it, today we're going to be focused on understanding the car-free mobility related attitudes, intentions, and behaviors of teens in the Portland, Oregon metropolitan area. That was the population that we worked with, but I also looked at studies done in other areas, and I'm currently working on a project in another part of Oregon. I'm in a much smaller city, so I'll try to make some connections to other regions as well. We want to identify communication channels and settings that could be most effective with youth in regards to transportation system information and promotion. And then lastly, study the data to learn how strategic themes promoting car-free mobility were perceived by Oregon youth. And I have some recommendations for transportation system planners and communication professionals who want to make these kinds of messages. Just to review some of the past research on youth and car-free mobility, going into this study, I did an extensive literature review to look at what else have people discovered about youth and their experiences with transit, their opinions about riding bikes and walking. And research basically showed that once driving becomes an option, many teens abandon car-free mobility. There were national and regional focus studies that showed this shift. And while one goal of my research is to document these types of trends, I would say the larger goal of what I'm going to be talking to you about is to talk to you about how to possibly shift these types of perceptions to align more with sustainable support for non-car mobility. It's important to note that the reasons provided here for youth, why they choose car-free mobility, things like high costs associated with cars, they're not necessarily conscious or preferred choices that teens are making. For example, it might be that youth are carefully weighing the pros and cons of driving and the costs associated with gas and maintenance against how cheap it is to choose car-free mobility, and making logical choices about that. But more likely, it's that they would gladly pay the associated cost of driving, but they simply can't afford it. So even though this might be framed as a choice, some of these really aren't a choice at all. Few studies have focused on connecting transportation-related attitudes and behaviors of youth to developing messages that actually promote car-free mobility. But there's one really notable exception, and that was a study done with teenagers in Florida by Kane and colleagues. And I'm happy to share references with anyone. This study is the closest to the work I'm presenting today, and if you're interested in this topic, that would be the next paper I would recommend reading. The Kane study messaging recommendations were based on 5 mobility themes related to teen use of public transit. So they did focus groups as well, and they found that the 5 themes that came up a lot in these focus groups were safety, cost, access, availability, reliability, and the image associated with public transportation. What they came up with was recommending 3 potential communication strategies that they suggested could be successful with teenagers. First, they suggested highlighting how transit allows teens to be more independent and less reliant on their parents for transportation. They also suggested highlighting the safety benefits of using transit compared to the responsibility of driving. And then lastly, highlighting the high cost of car travel and the better uses of teens' money to save for things that teens care about, like clothes or concert tickets, right? So I used this research and made sure to bring up these ideas in the focus groups I conducted to see if they translated for Portland teens, and it was about a decade later. So to see if they were still relevant a decade later and in a totally different area. Here's the citation, which will be available in the slides that you get. Okay, so to overview the research that I'm going to be talking about today, it again was with Portland youth. The goal was to create and evaluate communication messaging that fosters more positive attitudes, intentions, and behaviors related to transit and other car-free mobility options among youth. We conducted 3 focus groups with teens entering the 7th, 8th, and 9th grade. And there were 2 stages of research. First, we focused on understanding youth attitudes, behaviors, and motivations related to car-free mobility. And then secondly, we actually showed them some messages that we developed centering around a few different strategic themes that I'll talk about. And we gathered their feedback about these messages and themes. There were 28 total participants in the study. 16 were male and 12 were female. Of the 28 participants, 22 identified their race or ethnicity as Black, 3 as Hispanic, and 3 as white. They were all recruited from postings at over 30 regional after-school programs and summer youth programs. And we basically paid them $50 for the focus group and got parental consent. And of course, it's all approved by our ethics board here at the University of Oregon. I'm going to be talking a little bit in a couple of slides about the theory of planned behavior, and this is really how the analysis was conducted. So if you are familiar with it already, it'll just be a refresher, and if not, I'll definitely give you enough that you kind of understand why we focused on those points. I also want to mention that going into the study, we had the idea from some background research that possibly texting could be one way to reach youth about car-free mobility. So within the focus group, we talked about that a lot, and we also explored other channels and settings that youth might want to receive messages through. And so you'll see that theme coming up as well in the results. The theory of planned behavior is the major theory that I used in this research. And this is perhaps one of the most widely used theories to predict and explain behavior. It relies heavily on three main constructs. One is attitudes. So people's attitudes affect their intentions, which then affect behavior, subjective norms, and perceived behavioral control. My study applies this theory of planned behavior to understand what is motivating youth to choose or not choose car-free mobility. And also we used it to contextualize the feedback that we got when we showed them our sample messages. We use this theory because honestly, it's been used actually a lot to explain transportation choices among adults. There were dozens of articles that had successfully applied this theory to explain why adults choose transit or why adults bike, but we hadn't seen it applied with youth, and so that's what we are attempting to do here. The theory of planned behavior, as I mentioned, is a model of behavioral determination, and it's based on attitudes, normative beliefs, and perceived behavioral control coming together to predict an individual's intention to perform the behavior. Attitudes related to car-free mobility are observed when an individual attaches a positive or a negative value to the behavior or its attributes or outcomes. So let me give you an example. I like to think in examples. A young person may express a positive attitude about how much they enjoy the feeling of wind on their face when they ride their bike. Or they would be expressing a negative attitude if they talked about how slow they think the bus is compared to driving. Normative beliefs within the theory of planned behavior are subjective beliefs about whether other people, typically other people that are important to them, that they're motivated to attend to and comply with, whether they approve or disapprove of the behavior. And so two of the main sort of normative influences that we found with teens and other research has found are parents and friends. And so we looked at those extensively in the research. And so for example, youth may discuss how much their parents want them to ride the bus. And so that would be counted as a positive normative belief towards towards car-free mobility. Perceived behavioral control describes an individual's sense of perceived ability to perform the behavior. A young person's perception of how easy or difficult it is for them to ride light rail, for instance, or to walk to their destinations are examples of perceived behavioral control. Personal agency or control over the ease or difficulty is often associated with this variable of perceived control. Lastly, intention to perform the behavior is seen as a crucial predictor of the actual behavior, especially for planned activities like riding a bus, right? So as a young person might express their plans to walk more or conversely to drive as an example of car-free mobility related intentions. Okay, so with that in mind, we had the focus groups. They were all about an hour and a half each. We transcribed them and then went through a systematic coding process, really looking for attitude related comments, normative related comments, comments about their control beliefs, intention comments. And we also really focused on any stories they told about their personal experiences, because we know from psychology research that when people express opinions that are based on direct experience rather than something they heard from someone else or something like that, experiences are the most influential. Our personal experiences tend to influence us the most. And so we were also looking for those personal stories because we knew those would be powerful. And here's what we found. In terms of positive attitudes relevant to car-free mobility, I put up a couple of quotes from two of the different focus groups. Overall, participants generally expressed positive attitudes about walking and biking, although most stated they didn't do either activity very regularly. Participants were quick to indicate that walking can be fun and that it was cheaper than any other mobility method. Some participants also mentioned the exercise benefits of walking or biking. In Portland, there is light rail as an option. So riding light rail was also discussed with a positive attitude by several participants, mostly because it was faster than waiting for their parents to give them a ride. And this came up a lot, the annoyance at waiting on their parents. So for example, this person in the first focus group said, I like taking the Max, that's Portland's light rail, because it's like faster, and this is their language, by the way, because by the time you get there, my mama would have probably just be walking out the house, right? And so parents taking a long time, as I mentioned, was a common experience among the participants. They have lots of stories related to that. I think just about every participant felt this way. And so here's another quote related to that, talking about how slow their parents is, and they would just rather catch the Max. It wasn't all positive. There were negative attitudes relevant to car-free mobility, and these are important to understand as transportation planners and communication strategists. Participants expressed concerning negative attitudes about riding the bus or light rail that were steeped in their personal experiences. And I want to emphasize that, because this means that these negative attitudes, they're very entrenched. They're going to be difficult to overcome and very difficult to turn around. They were often centered on feelings of uncertainty, anxiety, safety concerns, and especially for the girls in our group, sexual harassment that they may have personally experienced when riding public transit. Here's an example of some of the experiences, and there were pages of these stories, and so I tried to pick ones that could kind of fit on our screen today. But reading the first one here. Men, being a girl, when men, they come up to you and they approach you and they're like, and you're grown, and you're like, I'm a little girl, or you're just not interested at all, and they don't take no for an answer. That's really scary, because I've been groped and grabbed, and it's because I said no, they just don't listen. And this participant is talking about her experiences on both light rail and the bus system. And then another participant said, like, somebody yelling and like yelling at other people, or a guy with a knife was on the bus once, like standing right next to the bus driver, and he wouldn't go sit down. He just stayed next to the bus driver, so we had to get off the bus. And this participant is talking about a time that her and her brother were on the bus together, and they decided to get off in the middle of their trip because they felt unsafe. Nearly every participant had negative attitudes, had some negative attitude about public transit. The main negative associations with walking or biking were that it can be boring or tiring. There certainly weren't hardly any stories about sort of negative things that happened when they were walking or biking, as compared to the many transit stories that folks had. Some people said the opposite, though, that walking and biking is not boring, it's actually fun. So there wasn't agreement there. A minority of the participants did mention that they disliked walking at night due to safety concerns. When we move on to normative beliefs, again, this is thinking about what other people who are important to them think about non-car mobility or car-free mobility. So again, I kind of pulled a couple quotes for us to think about. But normative beliefs, they really came up less often than attitudes throughout the discussion, although there was some overlap as demonstrated by the string of participant responses at the top here. So someone was saying, yeah, people only really talk about the bus if it's, and then someone else interrupted bad, and another person said terrible, and then a fourth participant said something weird happens. So they're not really having conversations about the bus just in their daily lives, only if maybe someone has a, funny or bad story to tell about something that happened. The most common normative belief among participants was related to their parents' support or lack of support for them riding transit. It seems like most participants' parents encouraged or even required that participants ride transit, but sometimes parents were also described as having safety concerns related to transit. So for example, one participant said, my dad, he doesn't like giving me the rides, but like I said before, he's really overprotective. So he's confusing sometimes, because like I ask him for a ride and he's like, no, you have to go on the bus. And then when I don't want to go on the bus, no, when I want to go on the bus, he's like, no, I'm going to give you a ride. And so there were some mixed messages from parents and friends, especially regarding to riding the bus and light rail, about whether they supported it or didn't support it. It did appear that most of the lack of support was just safety concerns from parents, and then lack of support among friends was usually just the time or hassle. Normative beliefs that were associated with walking or biking were mostly non-existent from the conversation. It just didn't come up. We tried to prompt it. There just wasn't much there. So it's just not something that they tend to talk about with their friends, or really think about what do their friends or parents think about them walking or biking. Perceived behavioral control beliefs relevant to car-free mobility. So again, I've pulled up a couple of quotes for us to think about. Participants had a high degree of confidence in their ability to navigate the transportation system by walking, biking, or riding public transportation. Participants felt strongly that they knew most of the information they needed to know to get around without a car, and they could easily find any information they didn't know using their smartphone. So for example, one person said, I know where I'm going because I've been here all my life, so it's like, it's no worry for me. And another participant said, I like to use the app sometimes to check when my bus and my max come, but I know where everything takes me now. And this was actually a surprise for us. We were expecting teens to be perhaps a little confused about how to use the transit system in particular, and they were absolutely not. They were showing us on their phones, and this just was not an issue, a barrier for them at all. Perceived behavioral control actions relevant to car-free mobility. So just on a side note, while they felt very confident on how easy it was to access those bike trails or to access transit, one thing that they do is really manage what their experience is going to be like. So they sometimes feel like they have some control over what will my experience be like when I ride the bus, or feeling like they don't know, that it's unpredictable what the experience will be like, was also sort of a source of anxiety. So here's an example of what one participant expressed that he does to try to control his experience when he's riding transit. He said, I be trying to block off so nobody sit next to me. And then some of the other participants laughed. This seemed like a common way to control their experience. I like put my foot up and I put my backpack up there. I like no one else to sit next to me if they don't know you, right? Another issue related to control that came up in two of the focus groups was that participants lacked access to a bicycle despite wanting to use that mode of transportation. So this was an example of them actually being motivated to use car-free mobility through a bicycle. But a couple of them had mentioned they had a bike, but it got stolen, or they had a bike, but it has a flat tire and they don't know how to fix it, or they had a bike, but now it's too small for them and they can't afford to get a new bike. So access to bikes was an issue that came up in two of the three focus groups. Moving on to intentions relevant to car-free mobility. This wasn't a surprise. This was very consistent with past literature. Nearly every participant stated that they intended to drive rather than use some form of car-free mobility as soon as they're old enough and or have the money to get a car and operate it. For example, here you can see a participant in one of the focus groups stated, driving is the best. If I get a car, I'll never ride again. And another participant in a different focus group stated, I'm fine with doing it now. And by it, they mean car-free mobility. But when I turn 16, I plan on getting a car, like it's just faster. And it seemed like they felt it would be more convenient for them. And also there was definitely like a factor that people talked about in terms of feeling like that was a rite of passage in some way. So while still expressing their preferences for driving when they're able, several participants cited financial constraints as a reason they may still use car-free mobility even when they're old enough to drive. For example, a participant in one of the focus groups stated, it depends, like the distance. Maybe you have a little bit of gas money, you don't got enough money, so they would have to take a car-free option. Participants were asked if they ever thought about walking, biking, or riding transit more now than they already do, and nearly every participant said no, they don't think about doing it more than they already do. Some expressing that they wish they did it less. And for example, one of the participants said, if I can ride less, I would definitely ride less. And they're talking about riding the bus or light rail. So that kind of wraps up where they are at on the main constructs of the theory of planned behavior. And you can see some are positive and leaning towards practicing car-free mobility, and some hurdles to definitely overcome with this population. We also asked them about their preferred channels and settings for car-free mobility, and they mentioned things like the local transit app or website. They are going on there to check the bus routes and those things, so if there was some communication present there. YouTube ads were seen as something that they do get exposed to. A number of participants actually mentioned local broadcast news, not because they really liked watching it that much, but they said they actually do end up watching it quite a bit because their parents have it on and they're sitting in the living room or something while their parents are watching it. They generally, as a group, did not and would not follow local government organizations on social media sites, and they didn't generally want to receive text messages from local government or organizations about transportation. Pretty much the only way they said they would sign up to receive text messages was being paid to do so, which doesn't seem very practical. So, but many of them expressed that their parents might be interested in something like that because their parents are often the ones passing on transportation related information to them. So they prefer getting transportation information directly from their parents. So they said, tell my parents and my parents will tell me. Another option that wasn't discussed as much, but certainly was discussed a little bit, was their heavy use of music streaming services, like Pandora or something like that. And so you can localize those ads. That might be something to consider because they were very popular with this age group, and almost all of our participants use the free services, which have ads in them. And then possibly social media ads. So you're not going to get organic reach or engagement. They're not going to follow or like generally transportation related messages or messages from government or transportation organizations. But you could get some paid boosting or paid ads that would reach them because they are on those channels. Okay, let's talk about the messaging reactions and strategies. So we actually tested 3 sets of messages. Each of those sets had 5 text messages representing them. Each set was based on a different type of strategic appeal. These strategic appeals were based on past research like Kane's study that recommended autonomy appeals, and then also other communication research that discussed like what types of appeals might be popular with youth. We showed these messages to youth, and then they wrote their reactions underneath each one. And then we systematically coded it, myself and my graduate student independently, and then we came back and compared to look for things like positive reactions, whether they thought it was funny, whether they thought it was authentic, helpful, those sorts of things. And then let me tell you a little bit more about each theme, and then I'll talk to you about the results. Here's an example of the autonomy appeals. So when we are appealing to autonomy, we're trying to appeal to teens' desire for independence from their parents, which came up a lot in the focus groups. Messages with this theme may suggest that by teens choosing their own car-free transportation, they can attain greater freedom, which reduces reliance on others to meet transportation needs. Messages with an autonomy appeal may try to get teens to recall a moment when they felt frustrated by their reliance on others. Autonomy appeals are also likely to associate teens' selection of car-free transportation with supporting teens' goals of autonomy, achievement, and competence. So you can see in these messages that we're encouraging teens to sort of make their own choices and reminding them of why they don't want to rely on cars or other people giving them rides. Okay, the next set of appeals is what we deemed FOMO appeals, or fear of missing out. This was something that came up in the literature as possibly especially relevant to Gen Z age groups. And so the FOMO theme appeals to teens' desire for social connection and to be seen as operating within social norms of the group. This theme presents an idea to an audience member as contagious, it's popular, this is a trending thing to do. This strategy may not be as effective at changing strongly held opinions, but research shows it can sway the undecided or serve as a useful reminder for people who already support the message. Crafted messages may attempt to demonstrate that a behavior must be normal, so many people think, oh, other people are doing it, or this is the types of things that we are. It sort of appeals to their local identity and wanting to contribute to that. So you can kind of see some of the messages in this theme as well. Lastly, Gen Z appeals were specifically based on research done to try to explain what are Gen Z what are they like? What are they interested in? What are they going to respond to? And what we found was that, according to research, Gen Z themes would appeal to teens' desire to be valued, to be seen as having important needs and wants. Messages within this theme would validate teens' experiences and needs by communicating how important they are, in like an empowerment type of message. Messages with a Gen Z appeal are likely to impress upon teens that public transit authority consider their needs and wants of teens when they're making decisions. They also try to give some sort of personalization and often will use feedback as part of it. So Gen Z folks can feel like they're contributing and have a say in what's happening. There's less research available on the effects of Gen Z type appeals. Obviously, they're relatively new. And so we wanted to include them because this is the audience that we're speaking to. Okay, so to wrap up on the reactions to these messages, there were positive reactions were significantly higher for autonomy and FOMO compared to Gen Z. So autonomy got the most positive reactions, things like, I like it, that's great, you know, some sort of approval. And Gen Z, only a third of the messages, less than a third, got a positive reaction. For negative reactions, you see the exact opposite pattern. So 2/3 of the Gen Z messages resulted in some sort of negative reaction. And those were things like, that's stupid, I don't believe this, even counter arguing it, like, no, that's not how it really works, or my mom says this actually. So, you know, arguing with the message as they're sort of making their reaction. And then a little bit less than half of the FOMO and autonomy messages, and this was a significant difference, received negative reactions. We wanted to discuss, or at least examine, how funny they found messages, and we thought this would be a positive. If they found a message humorous, it would at least get them to pay attention to it a little bit more. We didn't expect every message to be funny, but we tried to throw in some message that would be funny in each of the appeal categories. And overall, 15% of autonomy messages were seen as having some amount of humor in them, compared to Gen Z at just 1%. And this was a significant difference. We also coded for whether messages were seen as helpful or likely, how likely they were to follow through. Like if teens commented something like, oh, I'd do that. Like if they said, oh, I'd do whatever the message is telling me. There was no difference between the three types of appeals, unlike the other results I showed you. There was no significant difference between any of the appeals. Overall, across all the appeals, about 9% were seen as helpful, and about 7% of the messages resulted in a reaction where they would be likely to follow through with them. We also measured for personal relevance reactions, things like, oh, this is me, or I do this, or when they're saying, indicating something's authentic to their experience. And we found a significant difference with the autonomy appeals, 19% of them having some sort of personal relevance reaction versus only 11% of the FOMO appeals and 4% of the Gen Z, and this was a significant difference. We were more concerned with the overall theme reactions because we wouldn't intend for those 5 messages within the theme to be it. So you would just, those were just examples of what autonomy could look like. And so if you knew that autonomy, for instance, was the best theme to go with, you could create a series of messages just centered around this idea of autonomy. Whether they were exactly worded like our autonomy messages or not, wouldn't really matter. And then also I want to point out that the messages wouldn't have to be delivered on a phone. This is just, we tried to do this to make it more realistic, but you could certainly take an autonomy appeal and move it to a poster or a social media ad or something like that. These were the three most individually positive rated messages in terms of positive feedback, being funny, being relevant, sort of all of those things considered. These were the top three individual messages. Two of them come from autonomy, and one is a FOMO message. Overall, the three messages that received this are here. And, you know, you can kind of see they're personalized to the city. Two of them mention Portland in particular, and you'll see in the negatively reviewed messages, those are more generic. And then one of them hits on like probably the most popular theme in the focus group, which is how they hate waiting on their parents for rides. These are the four most negatively reviewed messages. Most of these come from the Gen Z theme. And what you see here is consistent negative feedback, like they just outright rejected these, they counter-argued them, they said it wasn't helpful or relevant to their lives. All of these messages, none of these messages mention Portland specifically or have any sort of regional context to them, which stands in contrast to the ones that they liked. And so that's something to consider. And they also were pretty negative about having to fill out surveys. We thought they might appreciate giving feedback, but they didn't really like that as an option. So this first message that asked them to fill out a survey was extremely negatively rated. Okay, so coming to the discussion, what does this all mean? What can we conclude from this research? I've put up the outcomes or the objectives that we're hoping to achieve today, and I want to touch on each of these. Results from when we talked to them about their attitudes and intentions provided several key insights and recommendations for car-free mobility message development and dissemination targeting youth. So I do want to point out that comparing our study's results to the really only other study that I could find that actually looked at car-free mobility messages, the Kane study that I referenced. Remember, the Kane study recommended three things, autonomy being one of them. So I'm going to talk to you about what did we find that was similar to past research. And I think that you can take that more strongly because you can say, okay, this has been found in more than one place with more than one group of youth. So it might be more of a universal experience. So here's the thing that is similar to past research. So we also found that parents are key influencers among this target public on the issue of transportation. Similar to other studies, this research found support for autonomy appeals that encourage teens to be less reliant on their parents for transportation. Another similarity among past studies findings were that teens' belief that public transportation is more economical. Even if they thought it was slower and less reliable, they did recognize that it was cheaper. But one notable difference in our research findings that I'm presenting today and Kane's study of Florida teens was that teens rarely, if ever, expressed concerns about a negative self-image associated with transit in my study. So teens really had no problem with people knowing they rode the bus. They didn't feel like it was uncool. They just felt like it was a hassle. It wasn't that it didn't have negative connotations for them socially or personally. But that was found in the Florida study. So that's something to consider if you're looking to do this in your area, you know, trying to figure out whether that would apply to your teens or not. So teens did, in this study, didn't seem to feel stigmatized when using transit and expressed that it was a normative behavior among their peer groups. Kane's findings in the Florida study also recommended highlighting the safety benefits of transit compared to the responsibility of driving. For the teens in the Portland study, this recommendation is likely to be seen as untrue and inauthentic to their experience because one of the main and deeply ingrained narratives that we found around transit was how unsafe and unpredictable our teens felt that it was. Related to Kane's third messaging recommendation about highlighting the high cost of car travel and the better uses of their money, like to buy things like clothes, you know, with our teens in Portland, something like this may ring true, but based on the participants we talked to, it's a reluctant truth. So it's not really likely to change their driving behavior. They clearly stated that money was a barrier to car use, but they felt strongly like they didn't care. And if they could get the money, they were still going to use a car. So some theory-based messaging recommendations. If you were designing messages for teens, you want to think about promoting that autonomy appeal, thinking about messages that spoke to any safety improvements that were made so that participants could feel like they could be more safe and have better experiences riding transit. Thinking about highlighting how it's okay and normative with their friends, and probably not using Gen Z related appeals. Those tested very negatively. They weren't interested in feedback. They thought it was inauthentic that transportation planners would care what they thought. It just did not ring true for them. And also, we already talked about some of the channels and settings that we would recommend, but I'm happy to answer more questions about that. And also talk about any limitations that you might want to consider if you're going to use this research going forward. So thank you so much. This is my email. If you would like to email me directly, I'm happy, and I know the information, you'll have it as well in the webinar wrap-up, but I'm happy to take questions, and I just kind of created this key takeaway slide for you to digest as we're doing questions.
Great, thank you so much, Autumn. Great presentation and a lot of takeaways for the audience. We do have a few questions from the audience, but for those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue to submit your questions if you have them. All right, so one of the first questions was about the teens that you surveyed, and we're wondering if you could give more information on their socio and economic backgrounds.
That's a great question. So we originally hoped to get a nice mix of socioeconomic backgrounds, and so that's why we kind of cast a broad net in our recruitment. And I had a team of 6 undergrads that were helping to create the messages and to do the recruitment, and we ended up reaching out to over 30 after school and summer camp groups around Portland. And many of them agreed to post our recruitment messages or even let us come in and do a talk or something like that. But we did not get what would be considered a representative sample for Portland. So for instance, we were heavily skewed towards African-American youth, whereas Portland is almost the exact opposite demographics of what we got. We did not ask them any questions about their socioeconomic status. But I certainly could pick up on some cues from the focus groups about, participants talking about how their parents didn't have money or their parents complained about costs. So I can assume that the groups also skewed low SES based on some of the cues participants gave as well. So that's something to consider, and that wasn't necessarily our intention. But in some ways, I'm really glad that we've got a diverse group who actually seemed pretty passionate about the issue of transportation. They cared how they got around.
Great, thank you. All right, and you had mentioned that one of the methods would be to convey and communicate through parents. And so a question was asked about any successful communication strategies targeting parents of teens.
Yeah, so this is actually something I want to follow up on in a future study is testing some of these ideas with parents. But I've worked with parents a lot on various health issues as parents as a target audience to get their child to do something. And I would say that, far and away, almost every issue I've worked on, you can appeal to parents with talking about safety. So I think talking to parents about some of those public health reasons that I presented in the first few slides, talking about trying to get parents to realize that driving a car or being a passenger in a car is actually one of the most dangerous things a teen can do in the US. And so helping them to realize how much safer transit and other car-free mobility options actually are. With that said, there's been some negative experiences on transit in particular.
Hello, it sounds like Autumn's audio stopped working.
Oh no!
Lisa, are you able to hear her?
Oh, I am actually.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay.
I can hear you. if
Okay.
you're, yeah, if there are folks that,
I'll keep going. Oh no.
okay.
I didn't do anything, so hopefully I didn't touch anything. So I think there's some counter messaging there, but I would start by trying to help parents realize that it's actually safer for their kids to engage in car-free mobility. And then I think parents, depending on their SES, may also care about the cost savings. And then also depending on the city, you may also find some room with environmental appeals as well.
Great. All right, and this is a nice follow-up question to that. And similarly, do you have suggestions on how to empower youth who have the legitimate safety concerns with riding transit?
Mm-hmm. Oh, teens had a lot to say about that. They had a lot to say about that. I honestly think that there probably needs to be some changes within the way things operate to convince teens that things are changing. So I'm gonna skip those for a second and talk about if you were not to change anything at all, but you wanted to help teens feel more empowered. They didn't have a good understanding of what to do when something like this happens to them. Do they tell the driver? Do they call someone? Do they text someone? And so if there was communication materials developed, like to explain, hey, if something like this happens to you, here's what to do. And I assume somebody else has a really good idea about what the safest thing to do when something like that happens, that would be great. They would at least feel like they have something, some agency, like if something, they're getting harassed, here's what I can do about it. And so I would definitely recommend some sort of messaging campaign around that. And then obviously, teens felt like there should be more security, more regulation of people who maybe appeared to be abusing some sort of substance and riding transit, possibly like more connection with the driver in terms of just having a support system there were some of the things that they mentioned.
Okay, great. A lot of great ideas. All right. We have another comment or in question about anecdotally, their impression is that people who don't currently use transit typically don't know the transit opportunities they have, but you suggested that information wasn't a barrier for the teens. Could you comment further on that?
And it's important to keep in mind that this was a qualitative study with a relatively contained sample, and so that could be true as well. Both things could be true at the same time. For the teens we talked to, they weren't all transit riders, but they all at least did bike or walked or they did something, and they universally just had no issue with looking information up on their phone. And again, there may be other teens out there that do feel confused about it. They didn't talk to us. But I am actually doing a very similar study in the Eugene Springfield area where transit ridership is lower than in Portland. And so we're looking at that issue again. And, hopefully I'll be back next year, something to tell you about those results. But we're just in the ethics approval process, so we haven't talked with teens yet.
Great. Yeah, really excited to hear more about that research. All right, and we have another question from the audience. What were the demographic differences between the Portland and Florida focus groups, specifically with the age range? Would you predict differences in responses to questions around safety and social expectations for 13 to 17-year-olds?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't have the demographics of the Florida study memorized, but I don't think that, if I'm remembering correctly, gosh, their group may have been slightly older. So we were looking at, 7th, 8th, 9th graders, and I think they were more like 9, 10, 11th graders. So that could be a factor. Maybe it's still cool with, 8th graders, but maybe once you're an 11th grader, once you have the chance to drive, then it becomes uncool. And that might be why that was something that was so prominent in their study. So that's definitely something to consider. There's probably regional differences between Portland and Florida, and also about a decade in between the research. So that's why I think it's good to focus on the things that we found that were the same. So you can say like, oh, those are really like the autonomy appeals, for instance. Those may be like universal concepts that could apply a number of places. And then for the points that I mentioned were different, you probably want to go into your own region and see like which one seems to be applying to you.
Great, yeah. All right, another question on the focus groups. Was there any discussion regarding vehicle ownership or driving as a status symbol, especially for the lower SES groups? They've read that non-car mobility is seen as for quote unquote for poor people, and so strive for vehicle mobility as a way to improve their mobility freedom as well as social status.
Yes, I think being able to afford a car or being 16 and being able to drive, it was sort of discussed as not only a status symbol, but a rite of passage. And some people, when they mentioned like, oh, but I probably won't be able to afford it, other teens kind of laughed and they were like, me too, or something like that. But it is, I hear what you're saying, and I definitely agree that it is seen in that way. And one of the things I didn't mention, but we do recommend in the longer report, is to kind of look into higher up age groups to see like what is happening between I'm using non-car mobility almost every day to like I'm not going to use it at all, and sort of that cutoff that happens around 16 and they start getting rides with friends even if they can't afford a car and whatnot.
Great. All right, and another question actually about seasonal ridership or car-free mobility. Were there considerations or attitudes discussed of car-free mobility at different periods of the year, like during the hot summer or rainy, snowy winters?
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm glad someone brought that up. And they also in Portland, they have, as they're going into high school, they get a free transit pass that starts during the school year. So that was something a lot of them were looking forward to. And so they're a little more on their own in the summer. During the day, they're riding transit, for instance, or walking or biking a lot more because their parents may be at work in the summer and they're home all day and bored. So it definitely seemed like their use went up in the summer. Their car-free mobility went up in the summer. Although many of them mentioned riding the bus to school during the year. And they also, some people did mention things like not wanting to walk a far distance if it's raining or cold or dark. It gets dark so early in the winter in the Northwest. So yeah, those concerns, I definitely think there are seasonal concerns.
Okay, great. All right, and let's see here. Got a time for a couple more questions. Do you have any background on what kind of car-free education these youth had previously received prior to the study?
Oh, great question again. Yeah, we did ask them, who talks with you about this? Have you gotten anything from your school? Have you ever gotten, a flyer, or do they talk about bikes or, that sort of thing? And pretty much just their parents, and mostly just like because their parents don't want to give them a ride. Or for some of our bicycle riders, heavy bicycle riders in the group, their parents would ride bikes with them and sort of introduce them into how to use the bike lanes and that sort of thing. Almost all of them said they had not gotten any information about car-free mobility. We, by the way, did not call it car-free mobility when we were talking with teens, just so you know. That's our term, but we always said biking or scooting or walking, whatever the normal term was. Which I'm surprised because I know their safe routes to school is very prevalent in Portland. And so I actually know that information is present at the schools, but they're not paying attention to it.
Interesting. And it looks like we have time just for one more question. And there are a few additional questions that were asked that we won't get time to address, but we will try to reach out individually to those that did ask those questions. But just to end out the webinar, and you had mentioned this a little bit about your next steps with some research in Eugene and Springfield, but can you talk about any coordination or next steps that maybe came out of this Portland study with the local transit agency TriMet, and then also any information you could share about your current work with the city of Eugene and Springfield?
Yeah, so in terms of Portland coordination, we shared the results. I'm not sure how much they may or may not be doing with them. We would love to do another study where we actually develop the autonomy based messaging and test its effectiveness, whether it sort of actually promotes more car-free mobility, especially among people who maybe aren't doing it as much, youth who aren't doing it as much. But I would say, sort of the next big step is going, talking with Eugene and Springfield youth about some of these same questions, seeing if some of these same patterns can be found among a smaller city with still with transit access, but considerably less than Portland. And they'll be getting a free transit pass through their schools as well, starting in the fall. And so we do hope to actually develop some messaging and test it to see if we can get that pass to be well used. And we also have future plans, sort of after all of that, to try to talk to the parents about it and see what barriers parents have to encouraging their teens to use a free transit pass. And again, as someone else mentioned, sort of testing some of the ideas for how we can best talk to parents about this.
All right, well, great. Thank you so much, Autumn, again, and thank you everyone for joining us. I'm just pulling up our last slide here. All right, well, I'm not getting that up, but we will send out the slides and the video recording for everyone. Thank you for joining us today, everyone online, and thanks again to Autumn for sharing your work, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.